Hi clay friends, in this video lesson we're going to make a platter. I'm using Oregon white clay. It's a nice versatile clay. It's good for throwing or hand building, and it'll be great for this platter. It also, with a white background, will make some of the decorations pop, and we're going to use a two-color clay decoration on this with some Oregon red. So I've smoothed both sides of the slab. The slab is about 3/8 of an inch. So you can grab yourself a slab and hold up your template. This is the template that we made with the string and the push pin. So get your template and roll out a slab that's 3/8 of an inch. You can use a slab roller or a rolling pin with a couple of slats to get it a nice even 3/8. And then I've smoothed it on both sides to compress the clay on both sides. And I've got it on a board so that I can flip it back and forth without handling it. An important part of building this platter is to handle it as little as possible so that it doesn't warp later, because clay has memory and it's going to remember any handling or lifting that you did. So I've got enough here. So I'm going to rough out a design out of some Oregon red clay, and then later I'll add to that with some things on top of it. I have some really wet Oregon white for the foundation of my platter, and I've got some really wet Oregon red clay, so that I know that these two clays are going to expand and contract the same, and so they stick to each other. So you can use that to decorate. I rolled out some really thin coils here. So, and I'm using the rule of thirds. I wanted my lines running about the 1/3 point here. And then I'm just going to add some polka dots to the smaller, the end that's only 1/3 there. So I'm just tearing off some really, really wet clay, and I'm making some tiny little dots and spreading those around for some little polka dots later. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to go over it with the rolling pin. I have some Oregon red decorations on top of my Oregon white, and I'm going to gently go in with a rolling pin first. I'm going to go in gently and start in the middle and roll it towards me, and then I'll start in the middle again and gently roll it away from me. And I just want to compress that red down into the white clay. And if you don't have two clays in the same family that are different colors, you can use the same clay and you still, I'm not pressing super hard, so this is going to still leave a really interesting texture. So you can use this method with the same color clay and you'll just get some nice interesting textures there. So that's it. That's all I'm going to do for that. Now that I have my texture down, I'm going to go ahead and cut out my platter here. You can see I made just a really gentle mark there, and that was for planning purposes so that I could see where to lay my decorations down. But now I'm going to go ahead and cut out the actual platter. I cut our oval pattern out, and now I want to thin out the sides a little bit. With these oval platters, we start off at 3/8 of an inch, and then by the time we use the smoothing rib to compress it, it's thinned down, thinner definitely, but we leave it a little bit thicker in the center so it's rugged and durable and can survive the dishwasher. But we want the edges to be a little bit more delicate. We want to give it the illusion of being more delicate than it really is. So I'm going to use this pastry roller or pony roller. It has a rounded end, and I like to just go around the edge gently, and it thins out the edge and gives it a nicer line. You never want to leave that cut edge there. That 90-degree edge, when you fire it, is actually really sharp and can cut you, and it just doesn't look that great. So we're gonna work our way around here, smoothing this edge. And then we're going to use a second board to flip it over, and we'll smooth the edge from the back side as well. To flip this over, I'm going to lay a second board on top of it. So this is just another piece of sheetrock. I'm going to hold the two pieces of sheetrock tight and flip them over together. It is important with slab work to handle your slabs as little as possible. So this way it's going to maintain the integrity of the form and not stress it. And we can flip it over and add the foot ring. This is the back side of my platter, and I've already smoothed and compressed the back side of the slab. So now I'm just going to use that same pony roller and smooth out and thin out the edges again. Want to refine the edges a little bit. Now we're going to go back and use the original pattern that we made. And remember when we made this, we marked an inner ring to mark about 1 inch to 1.5 inches inside the outer ring to mark where we want our the foot ring to go. So I'm going to draw just a rough line. Doesn't need to be super tidy because we're going to use a serrated rib to score the heck out of this anyway. And then we're going to cut some strips out of our scraps. So I cut this oval out of a bigger slab. I saved the scraps and I'm going to cut some strips out of that slab to make our foot ring. So I'm just taking my serrated rib and dipping it in water, and I'm going over the line that I just made. And this is going to be the area. I'm cross-hatching both directions with my wet rib, and this is going to be the area where I'm going to attach the foot ring. We're going to cut a foot ring out of some scraps. One important part of this particular pattern method is when we put the foot ring on, it needs to be substantial because we're going to shape the platter and push it down in the center. So you want at least 1/2 inch, and depending on the size of platter you're doing, 1 inch all the way up to 1.5 inches is fine too, depending on the shape you're working with. So we're going to cut some strips out of scraps. If you say you wanted a 1 inch foot on here, if you happen to have a board that's 1 inch, the easiest way is just to use that as a guide and cut some strips out. If you don't have a board that's the right thickness, let's say for this particular platter, we're going to want 1 inch. So let's start with a straight line back here. And then we're just going to mark 1 inch at both ends. Got 1 inch. 1 inch. And we're just going to work our way down and cut some strips. If your scraps are long enough, you can do 1 long strip. Mine are not quite long enough, so I'm going to piece together 2 strips for my foot. So I'm going to get a couple strips, and then because even if you were doing 1 long strip, you would need to have a connection point. But with 2 strips, I'll have 2 connection points. So here we're just going to mark, oops, go here. Mark our 1 inch mark again. And then we're going to cut the ends, or we're going to join them at a 45-degree angle. So for the strips, this is the part that'll connect to the platter and the base that'll be sitting on the table. This I'm cutting straight up and down. So this is a 90-degree angle, and we'll smooth that off later. But these ends where they're going to connect, we want those at a 90-degree angle. So I'm going to put my knife all the way down to the table, holding it at a 45-degree angle pointing that way, and cut my strips like that. And with the scraps, I'll show you why. It opens up a lot more surface area. So when we go to connect this, we'll score these 2 sides, and then these 2 45-degree angles to come together like this, and it makes a much stronger seam. It gives you more area to join. So you can see I've run a thin coil around the inside, and that's going to help secure our foot ring to the platter itself. It's hard to see when I'm working inside, so I'll show you a sample here. So let's pretend that this is our platter and this is the foot ring. So you've got the joint here, and that's 2 separate pieces of clay. So that's a weak point that can crack apart in the firing. So we're laying a coil. I've got this coil around the inside first, and then I'm going to do a smaller coil on the outside. So you want to, first of all, place it tight, get it placed right up there against the foot ring, and then take one of your wooden tools and dip it in water, and you want to put the tool right in the middle of that coil and support the foot ring on the outside. So you've got something behind the foot ring, and then you're going to press right into the middle of that coil, and you want to drag half of the coil down onto the platter and half of the coil up on to the foot ring. So we're going both directions, up and down, and you want to work it well enough until you can't see that there's two separate pieces of clay. Visually, you want it to look like it's all one piece of clay. It works a lot better if your coil is really soft. So if your scraps have been laying out and getting dry, toss them back in the bag, give them a squirt of water to rehydrate them, and grab some really wet clay out of your bag. So you've got marks here from where I was dragging the coil up and down. Once you finish this off, you can go in either with the rounded end of your wooden knife tool or just a damp finger, and you can smooth this off so that you get rid of the tool marks there and get a nice blend. And you can't even tell that that was two separate pieces. And then we're going to do the same thing on the outside. So we would do a small ring on this outside. I have the inner coil all blended. Now I'm going to take a very thin coil and blend that around the outer edge. Again, I'm just firmly placing it right at the connection where the foot ring meets the platter. And then I'll blend it the exact same way. I'll use the wooden knife tool to drag half of the coil onto the platter and half onto the foot ring. I've added a coil on the inside and the outside and run my finger around to smooth that off. Then I want to do one final smoothing with a barely damp sponge. I don't want to introduce too much water at this point, but you can shape your foot ring and smooth it off. Make sure it's nice and smooth so it doesn't scratch your table. I will support this lower part. So I'll support where I just made that connection, but I can gently start to stretch this foot ring out and give it a bit of flair. So you can definitely play around with this and give your foot ring the personality that you want it to have. But again, just don't add too much water. We need this to be fairly firm to flip it over. Also, if you introduce too much water, you wash away all the fine particles and just leave the big groggy particles, and that's actually going to make it more likely to scratch your table. So we want to try to keep the fine particles in place. Once I get it smooth the way I want it and shaped the way I want it, I will go over it with one final smoothing with my red rubber rib. And what that does is it presses all that grog back in. So as I work it, you might be able to see getting some of the bigger particles come to the surface. So you can take that red rubber rib and go around and just compress. And the nice thing, this kind of bends, so you can work your way around and bend that a little bit and make sure that you're compressing all of that grog back down in there. So go ahead and smooth and shape your foot ring any way you like it. And then now is a great time to autograph the middle. And then we'll talk about flipping it over and rounding it out. I've smoothed out my foot ring the way I want it. So I'm going to lay another smaller piece of sheetrock on top, and we're going to flip it over. So that's a good way to flip it over, again, handling it as little as possible. If I were to try to jiggle this off, I would distort all that work that I just did on the nice smooth foot ring. So we're going to flip this over and then bend it up into shape. Okay, so we have our platter here, but it's not the shape we want yet. So the whole point of making a nice big foot ring is that now we've got room to shape this. So I like to go in with a barely damp sponge, and we're gonna go around and we're gonna press the center down and lift the sides up. And you can shape this as dramatically as you want to shape this, depending on how big the foot ring is. Do be careful going over the colored clay though, because you're gonna pick up parts of the red clay. So you wanna rinse your sponge frequently as you're going over the parts of the colored clay. So it's important to sneak up on the clay and move it just a little bit by little bit. Don't force this. Don't try to move it too much at once. So I'm just going all the way around once, and then each time I can start adding a little bit more pressure. Some people do this, they take a sock and fill a sock full of like beans or rice or something and pat it with a sock. My slab built platter has been setting up to leather hard now, and so I'm going to add another type of decoration to it. I want to stick with the rounded sort of dot theme here, so we've got some consistency yet some differences. So instead of the smaller dots, I'm going to come over here and put some larger dots. I just took a juice cap and outlined some circles. So these circles are the same size versus this side where we've got a little bit of difference in the sizes. I tried to scatter them around somewhat randomly, but they came out a little bit more evenly spaced and uniform than I actually wanted them to. So now I'm going to go in with a couple. I'm using velvet, Amico Velvet Underglaze. I'm going to go in with a couple different colors and layer up some colors on these dots and then let them firm up for a bit. I'm working the back side of my platter now, and I've added a little bit of color, repeating the dots. Sometimes it's nice to have a little surprise, maybe a surprise for the dishwasher who has to wash the platter, flips it over and has something to look at on the back. Also, sometimes it just feels unfinished or naked to leave the back completely blank. And then I'm going around the edges now with these are little hole punch tools, and continuing that circular theme, I'm just adding some hole punches to create circular polka dots in the foot. And it's also going to lighten this up a little bit. This is a pretty significant foot ring that I've put on my platter, and that adds a little bit of weight. So once I'm to a firm leather hard, I can go in and you can, if you want to, you can carve shapes through this. There's a lot of fun things that you can do with this at the leather hard stage. But this particular one, since I started with some polka dots, I'm going to continue on with that polka dot theme. And I'm just trying to go random here. And these little hole punchers work by just, you spin as you punch it through. So they're just little metal hole punchers. And I'm alternating sizes. These come in different sizes, so I'm kind of alternating big and small. And this will just kind of add some cohesion to the look here. We'll add some of the circular polka dot action to the foot ring, so it'll carry throughout the whole piece. To clean this up a little bit, I'm going to use a dry brush and brush away the scraps. And once I get the dry scraps brushed away, I'm going to go in with a paintbrush, just dip it in water, plain water, and I'm going to go around and I'm going to clean up these rough edges. These, again, we've got that 90-degree cut there that's sharp and not attractive. So I'm going to go through each of these holes and soften that edge with just some water on a paintbrush.